Bismillah walhamdulillah wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Assalamu alaikum everyone. Welcome back to the channel. This is lesson 21 and today we're covering chapter 7 of the essentials of Arabic grammar. So in the last lesson we've just wrapped up everything that it's absolutely essential to know about nominal sentences and nominal sentence structure. And in the next few lessons we're going to be diving into some specific rules related to i'rab that are very subtle but extremely important to know before we move on to the verb and verbal sentence structure. Starting with التعذر and the ism المقصور. And we're going to dive into what these two key terms represent by looking at some examples from the Quran. So we see here in the text, the signs of the ism are now clear, as well as other types like adamir, right? So we've learned everything that we need to know about the signs of the ism, like tanween, for example, right? Like al, for example, like the ta marbuta that's placed at the end of an ism. And then we took a look at many different asma that veer away from the common signs of a typical ism, like the damir, right? Like the personal pronoun, like the ismul istifham, like the asma'ul ishara, for example. But the asma to which an alif adhere, at the ending, no signs will appear. So anytime there is an ism that ends with an alif on its own, right? Not with a hamza after, like the word as-sama, for example. And this is what is referred to as an ism maqsoor, right? Any word, any ism that ends with an alif, right, on its own, right, without a hamza, and the letter before it, right, the letter that precedes it has a fatha, right? And the term maqsoor here from qasr, habs, right, to prevent something. At the ending of these types of words, no signs will appear, right? If it has a dhamma, then it will be inaudible, nor will it be seen. It's impossible, right? And this is the literal translation of the term at-ta'adhur. These particular asma are prevented from showing their signs of i'rab due to at-ta'adhur, right? The inability to do so. It's impossible for them to show that they're in the state of rafa, nasab, or jar. And this is why I say here that if it has a dhamma, it will be inaudible, right? Thus, any short vowels are implied. This is a rule that has never been denied. So reflect on a name like Musa or on names like Isa and Huda. So any short vowels in the state of rafa, nasab, or jar, they will not be shown on these particular asma. So let's take a look at these names that I've mentioned in an example here. And this is one of the categories of the ism maqsoor, right? An ism alam. So we see here on this first line, right? Musa talibun. Notice this alif at the end, right? The letter before it has a fatha, right? Clearly an ism maqsoor. So we know that the word Musa is an ism. It's ma'rifa, right? It's a proper name. And it begins this sentence, right? What does this fit the bill of? If you said a mubtada, then you're correct. And this would also mean that Musa is in the state of rafa. It's marfu'. But notice, right, there is no dhamma at the end here, signifying that it's in the state of rafa, right? The dhamma here is implied, right? It's muqaddar. And this word is prevented from doing so due to at-ta'adhur, right? It's impossible to do so. The only way that we can add a dhamma on this alif is to change the word entirely, which would be by adding a hamza on this alif, which would change the meaning, right? It would now be musa'u, or adding a hamza after the alif, which would be musa'u, right? This changes the meaning completely. It's impossible for us to place a vowel on a vowel, right? The alif acts as a long vowel, just as the letter waw may act as a long vowel, just as the letter ya may act as a long vowel, right? So this dhamma is implied, right? Musa is a student, right? Let's take a look at the next example. عند عيسى كتاب. And notice that this sentence begins with a dharf. عند. And we just took a look at a few different examples of this in the past lesson, right? Whenever the subject is nakira, right? It's indefinite, and the khabar or predicate is a shibhu jumla, then it is necessary for us to start this sentence with the khabar. In this case, being a dharf and its mudaf ilayh, right? So what state is the name Isa in? If you said it's in the state of jar, then you're correct, because it's a mudaf ilayhi to inda, right? So Isa has a book. The kasra here is implied, right? It's impossible to show due to at-ta'adhur, right? عند عيسى كتاب. Isa has a book. Again, in order for this kasra to be placed here, we would need to change this word entirely, right? It's impossible to put a vowel on a vowel. So we're going to get rid of this vowel here, right? Next up we have inna huda talibatun, right? And we've learned in the previous chapter, whenever inna is used to start a sentence, the mubtada is inna plus the ism in attendance, right? Inna huda, right? So we found our mubtada, but what would this mean? What state is the name huda in? If you said nasab, then you're correct, right? The fatha is implied. It's muqaddar on the alif. The sign of it being in the state of nasab is not this fatha on the dal, right? This is incorrect. And again, in order for us to place this fatha on the alif, right, we would need to change this word entirely by putting a hamza there or after this alif. But this word ends with an alif, and the letter before it has a fatha, right? This is how we know that it's an ism maqsoor, and it's prevented from showing this fatha, which is muqaddar, implied on this alif, due to at-ta'adhur, right? The inability to do so. It's impossible, right? So let's get rid of this fatha here. Indeed, Huda is a student. This is the ultimate student's guide to Quranic and literary Arabic, a structured curriculum on its own. To date, this channel is not monetized. I don't make any money off of these videos, but these videos are not free to create. I invest my own resources and time and energy and efforts into creating this content solely for your benefit. And so instead of buying a $5 latte at one of these overpriced cafes, I encourage you to support the channel and other important projects in the works by purchasing your copy of the Essentials of Arabic Grammar at shop.arabicessentialshub.com. Let's take a look at another example that highlights another category of the ism maqsoor. So we see here in this ayah, قُلْ إِنَّ هُدَى اللَّهِ هُوَ الْهُدَى. Similar format to what we've seen in the previous example, except huda here is not a name, right? The guidance of Allah or guidance from Allah, right? Inna huda Allah. So we have our ism maqsoor here. Alif at the end of this ism and the letter before it has a fatha. And notice that lafzul jalala is in the state of jar, right? It's a mudaf ilayhi to huda, right? Guidance, which means huda is ma'rifa, right? Taking its definiteness from lafzul jalala, right? And we know that the harf inna impacts its ism, changing it to a state of nasb, which means that huda is mansub, right? And huda is not mansub based on this fatha on the dal. Huda is mansub based on a fatha muqaddara, right? The fatha is implied on the alif. Very important to understand, right? It's impossible for it to show due to at-ta'adhur, right? It's impossible to place a vowel on a vowel, right? So inna huda Allahi huwa al-huda, al-huda, right? We see the same ism maqsoor, but this is again highlighting another category of the ism maqsoor, that which is ma'rifa bi-al, right? With alif lam at the beginning, right? It's made definite, right? Al-huda. Again, we've learned about many different types of alternative sentence structures, right? So I'm not going to go back into that here. Inshallah, you can go back to those other videos if this is unclear. But al-huda here, al-khabaru thani, right? A second khabar. Indeed, the guidance of Allah, it is the guidance, right? And what do we know about the state of the khabar? It is marfu', right? It's in the state of rafa, which means we have here a dhamma muqaddara, right? It's a dhamma that's implicit on the alif, right? And this does not just pertain to words with an alif maqsura. We also have, for example, the word al-asa, right? So there's no discrimination between which alif is used when it comes to the ism maqsoor. Let's take a look at another example from the Quran here to further drive home this point, right? We have in this ayah, وَأَلْزَمَهُمْ كَلِمَةَ التَّقْوَى, right? We have at-taqwa. We see it ends with an alif, right? No hamza after it or on it, right? It ends with an alif and the letter before it has a fatha, right? This is the sign of the ism maqsoor, right? And the question is, well, what state is at-taqwa in, right? Is it rafa, is it nasb, or is it jar? Because we don't have a sign at the end here showing us the state of this word. We have to rely purely on our knowledge, our understanding of these grammatical concepts that we've learned, right? And this is a great tip for you to always keep in mind, right? Whenever you want to know the state of a particular word, the first thing you want to do is look to the word before it. And if that word doesn't give you any indication, then you want to look to the word before that, etc., etc., right? And if we look to the word before at-taqwa, we see kalima, right? A word. So what role is kalima playing here? It clearly fits the bill of a mudaf, right? No alif lam, no tanween at the end. And we have at-taqwa following, right? Kalimat at-taqwa, the word of taqwa, the word of piety, right? Here translated as the declaration of faith, right? So if kalima is a mudaf, then at-taqwa is a mudaf ilayhi, which means it's in the state of jar, right? So the kasra here at the end of at-taqwa is implicit. It's impossible for it to display that it's in the state of jar, right? By showing this kasra at the end due to at-ta'adhur, right? This inability, right? Or impossibility to do so. Let's take a look at this final example from the Quran that highlights a very important nuance and category of the ism maqsoor, right? And that is when the ism maqsoor is nakira, when it is indefinite, right? And we see here, قَالُوا سَمِعْنَا فَتَى. And notice that fata has a tanween, right? Notice this here. Fathatain on the ta. And this is because it's nakira. Whether it is in the state of rafa, nasab, or jar, it is going to have this fathatain on the letter before the alif. Why? Because phonetically, this is how we distinguish that a word is nakira, indefinite, right? We add a fathatain, or a kasratain, or a dhammatain. This rule applies here as well. Also, right, phonetically, from a perspective of tajweed, if I was to continue, I'm going to merge this tanween with the word after, right? For example, قَالُوا سَمِعْنَا فَتًى يَذْكُرُهُمْ يُقَالُ لَهُ إِبْرَاهِيم, right? It still follows the same rules of a typical ism that's nakira, except in i'rab, right? The same rule applies here when it's nakira, right? The sign of its state is implicit on the alif. The tanween here is just something that is done phonetically and to let us know that it's nakira, right? Always keep this in mind. And this is very, very, very important to know, right? Now, it's a very, very short period before we get to the verb, which is going to be extremely, extremely important and fun. But I've kind of hinted to it a few different times, and maybe some of you know if you've had some prior study. Sami'na is a verb meaning we heard, meaning it already contains a doer of this action, which means fatan here is in the state of nasb. And I've mentioned in, the earlier chapters, right, that if a word has a fatha at the end, don't be disturbed, right? It's nasb like every object of a verb. Here, fatha is acting as the object of a verb. So it's in the state of nasb, right? And the sign of it being in the state of nasb is not this tanween, right, on the ta. It is a fatha muqaddara on the alif. Very important to know, right? And you can see many different examples of the ism maqsoor in a surah like Surah Al-Duha, for example. And just to further drive this point home, notice that when I stopped at fata, I said, قَالُوا سَمِعْنَا fata. I didn't say fatan, right? Again, phonetically, we follow the same types of rules that we would with any other ism, right? Notice, for example, in Surah Al-Adiyat, وَالْعَادِيَاتِ ضَبْحًا فَالْمُورِيَاتِ قَدْحًا. ضَبْحًا وَقَدْحًا, they're not from the Asma'ul Maqsura, right? These are regular isms that have tanween at the end. But whenever we stop, this tanween merges into the alif. Here, the alif is a part of the word. So this is very, very important to keep in mind, because many of times when we're reading texts, right, especially more advanced texts, they do not have harakat, right? So it's very important for us to understand these grammatical and syntactical concepts when it comes to translating these texts and understanding them, especially when it pertains to the Quran. And I can assure you guys, from my experience and from the things that I see, there are a ton of people, many people, who have not mastered and do not fully understand or even know these concepts that are ABCs. So these are very, very crucial to understand, or else we can misinterpret things, especially with things like this, right? If we assume that this fathatain here is indicating that this word is in the state of nasb and we're reading text, right? This could be very, very problematic. And of course, this is a very simple example, but as we move on and progress into more advanced readings and things like that, even beyond this channel, I have so many different things in store. So please make dua for me and please support the channel. If you've benefited from this video and you've benefited from my previous videos, don't forget to like share, and subscribe. Hopefully you guys did find benefit in this video and this clarified some points for those of you who are seeking clarification. And inshallah, I'll see you guys in the next video. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant. Astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.